For a brief moment, the world believed it was finally taking AI seriously. In November 2023, global leaders gathered at Bletchley Park, the birthplace of modern code breaking, to confront the risks of artificial intelligence. The symbolism was deliberate. History, danger, responsibility. A warning from the past. But listen closely to what happened next. Within just 18 months, the global conversation quietly shifted, not with a bang but with a slide, from safety to speed, from governance to growth, from what could go wrong to how fast can we deploy. And here's the uncomfortable truth. While the world debates abstract future risks, the real costs of AI are already being paid by workers, voters, and societies that rarely get a seat at the table. This is not a technical story, it is a political one. A story about who writes the rules and who lives with the consequences. If this analysis helps sharpen how you see AI power and global inequality, stay with me. Share it. These conversations shape what comes next, because to understand where AI governance is going, we first need to understand how it quietly drifted off course. And that brings us to the core question. When people hear the phrase AI governance, they often imagine something abstract. Committees, principles, ethics statements buried in PDFs. But governance is not theory. It is selection. It decides which risks are treated as urgent and which are dismissed as secondary, which harms deserve regulation, and which are reframed as acceptable trade-offs, and most importantly, whose problems count as global problems. In the past 2 years, AI summits have increasingly framed governance as a balancing act, safety on one side, innovation on the other. The implication is subtle but powerful. Too much governance slows progress. Too much caution holds back growth. Yet that framing already assumes a point of view. It reflects the priorities of countries that design frontier models, control capital, and capture most of the upside from AI deployment. For much of the global south, the problem is not theoretical misuse tomorrow. It is structural exposure today. Jobs without protection, data without ownership, technology without accountability. So before we ask how fast AI should move, we have to ask something more basic. Who is AI being governed for? To answer that, we need to step back and trace how this imbalance was built. And that requires history. To understand how we arrived here, we have to look at how AI governance emerged and who was present when the rules began to take shape. For more than a decade, global AI policy was not driven by universal need, but by concentration of power. Between 2011 and 2023, nearly 500 AI policies, standards, and guidelines were developed worldwide. Almost 2/3 came from the United States, Europe, or China. Latin America accounted for just 5%. Africa, 2%. This was not an accident. It followed the familiar cycle of technological globalization. Innovation is born in capital-rich economies. Standards are written where technical expertise and regulatory capacity already exist, and only later, often too late, are other societies invited to adapt. The digital divide was visible, the governance divide was quieter, rules focused on frontier risks, loss of control, model misuse, disinformation at scale. These are real concerns, but they reflect societies where labor markets are formal, institutions are relatively strong, and harm is expected to arrive in the future. In much of the global south, harm arrives first. AI did not enter as a distant threat. It entered as an extractive system. Data flowed outward, value flowed upward. Oversight never arrived, and once rules are written, they harden. That is the moment we are in now, and it is where the first real crisis begins. The first rupture didn't come from a malfunctioning model or a runaway algorithm. It came from labor. Across the global south, AI was not introduced as a futuristic replacement. It arrived quietly through platforms and contracts as work, low-paid, invisible work, data labeling, content moderation, call center scripts, the human scaffolding behind automated systems. Workers in countries like Kenya were paid as little as $1 to $2 an hour to review violent and graphic material, training moderation algorithms, while absorbing the psychological cost themselves. Indian call center employees helped refine customer service bots that are now automating their own jobs. This was not disruption on the horizon. It was displacement in slow motion. And yet, in global governance forums, these realities barely registered. The dominant narrative framed labor disruption as a future shock, something to be managed later once AI reached sufficient scale. But scale had already arrived, just unevenly. The productivity gains flowed north. The human costs stayed south. If governance is meant to anticipate harm, this was its first major failure. And if you find yourself questioning how innovation became detached from accountability, pause here. This is where the imbalance became systemic, because labor was only the beginning. The deeper mechanisms were still hidden, and that is what we need to uncover next. What made this imbalance so durable was not neglect, it was design. AI governance did not simply overlook the global south. It encoded assumptions that made those harms easier to ignore. The dominant model treats AI as a product, not a system. Risks are framed as edge cases, misuse, loss of control, malicious actors. Responsibility is assigned to developers and deployers, usually large firms operating within strong legal environments. But for much of the global south, AI is not a discrete product. It is an infrastructure imposed from outside. Data is extracted rather than owned. Models are trained on foreign assumptions. Deployment happens where oversight is weakest. When rules are written for high-income economies, they prioritize harms that threaten those economies, labor markets disrupted at scale, disinformation destabilizing established democracies, strategic competition at the technological frontier. Meanwhile, other risks are treated as secondary: psychological trauma for data workers, automated decisions with no appeal, biometric systems deployed without consent, electoral manipulation where media ecosystems are fragile. These are not bugs in the system. They are consequences of who the system was built for. Governance in practice became a filtering mechanism, amplifying some dangers while muting others. And once that filtering is normalized, it becomes very hard to reverse, which is why the next shift away from safety altogether was so consequential. Because just as these mechanisms hardened, the global conversation changed tone, and that change would trigger the second crisis. The second crisis didn't arrive as a warning, it arrived as optimism. By the time the AI Action Summit convened in Paris in early 2025, the language had shifted decisively. Safety was no longer the anchor. It was one item on a crowded agenda alongside innovation, deployment, competitiveness. Then came the announcement that mattered most. The next summit would be hosted in India, the first in the global south, and its focus would be impact, economic growth, productivity, opportunity. Indian officials were explicit. This was about moving away from safety and toward what AI could do for human development. For countries that feared missing yet another technological wave, the promise was intoxicating. AI as the last chance to grow rich before growing old. But here is the paradox. At the exact moment AI systems were being deployed most aggressively in emerging economies, the global governance conversation was loosening. Enforcement remained vague. Accountability was deferred. Risk was reframed as a future problem. Impact without governance became acceleration, and acceleration favors those already ahead. For the global south, this was not empowerment. It was exposure, because without strong rules, the same structural patterns repeat. Technologies developed elsewhere, benefits captured elsewhere, harms localized. The summit's symbolic shift masked a deeper reality. The conversation was moving faster, just not in a more inclusive direction, and that left ordinary people where they have always been in technological transitions, on the receiving end. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What does this actually mean for you? If you live in the global south, this debate is not abstract. It lands directly in your life. It shapes the job market you compete in, the data you generate without consent, the systems that judge you, often without explanation. You are told AI will bring opportunity, and it may, but opportunity without protection is a gamble you didn't choose. You may never see the boardroom where these systems are approved. You will never vote on the standards that govern them. Yet you will live with their decisions on hiring, credit, policing, speech, and when something goes wrong, accountability dissolves. The company is abroad. The model is opaque. The appeal process does not exist. This is how power quietly shifts, not through domination, but through default. If this feels familiar, it should. The same pattern has repeated with trade, finance, and digital platforms. If this analysis resonates with you, if you felt this imbalance but couldn't quite name it, share it. These stories stay invisible unless people recognize themselves in them. Because once you see how governance shapes everyday life, you stop asking whether AI is good or bad. You start asking something more important. Who does it actually serve? And that question doesn't stop at national borders. The effects ripple outward. What happens in the global south never stays there. When AI systems are deployed without strong governance in emerging economies, the effects propagate outward. Economically, politically, geopolitically, data extracted from millions of users flows into global models, shaping systems that are then sold back to the world. Labor practices normalized in weaker regulatory environments become benchmarks for efficiency elsewhere. Disinformation techniques tested where institutions are fragile are refined and later exported into more resilient democracies. This is how local vulnerability becomes global risk. At the same time, the geopolitical balance shifts. Countries with limited regulatory capacity face pressure to adopt AI quickly to remain competitive, even as development assistance from the global north is being cut. Funding for independent media, civil society, and regulatory institutions is shrinking precisely when scrutiny is most needed. The result is a feedback loop: faster deployment, weaker oversight, greater dependence on foreign technology. In this environment, governance is no longer just about safety. It becomes a matter of sovereignty. Who controls data flows? Who sets technical standards? Who has leverage when harms emerge? Ignoring these questions does not make them disappear. It ensures they are answered by default, by markets, by corporations, by power asymmetries, and when that happens, the consequences do not remain regional. They reshape the global system itself, which leaves us facing the hardest part of this analysis. Where does this trajectory lead? The future of AI governance is not fixed. It will be shaped by choices made now, often quietly, often without public debate. From here, three paths are emerging. The first is the optimistic scenario. Global South actors, including India, use their growing influence to recenter governance. Labor protections are integrated into AI standards. Data ownership replaces data extraction. Deployment is tied to accountability. This path does not slow innovation, it legitimizes it. The second is the muddled middle. Safety remains a talking point, impact remains the headline, and enforcement remains weak. Some harms are addressed after they surface, most are absorbed. Inequality narrows in rhetoric, but widens in practice. AI becomes normalized before it is governed. Then there is the third path, the most dangerous one: acceleration without restraint. Rules written by and for high-income economies. Emerging markets pressured to adopt systems they cannot regulate. Labor displacement deepens. Human rights violations become harder to trace. Democratic manipulation scales faster than institutional response. This is not collapse, it is erosion. Systems don't fail all at once. They hollow out, and governance once deferred is extraordinarily hard to rebuild. The question is not whether AI will reshape global power. It already is. The question is whether governance will arrive in time or only after the damage is done. We began with a summit meant to confront AI's greatest dangers. What we ended up with was something far more revealing. A global conversation that slowly drifted from safety to speed, from governance to growth, while the people most exposed to AI's risks remained largely unheard. This is the core insight. AI governance is not failing because the technology is too complex. It is failing because power is uneven. Rules are being written by those who benefit most from acceleration, not by those who bear the greatest costs of deployment. Impact without governance is not progress, it is repetition of old technological hierarchies in new digital form. If India's summit and those that follow are to matter, they must do more than showcase opportunity. They must re-anchor AI in accountability, labor protections, human rights, democratic integrity. Otherwise, the global south will be included in AI's future, but only as a testing ground. If this analysis sharpened how you see AI governance and global inequality, don't let it end here. Share it, discuss it, use it to question the narratives that frame speed as destiny. Because the rules of AI are being written now, and silence is a decision. I'll continue this conversation in the next video, where we look at who still has the power to change the trajectory and how. Stay with me.